APOLLYON Ex Machina by Stephen Goldin. Originally published in Chrysalis 6, an anthology edited by Roy Torgeson in 1980. Republished in a German edition of Playboy Science Fiction in 1982. It appeared in a collection of the author's stories called The Last Ghost and Other Stories in 1999, and another called Ghosts, Girls, and Other Phantasms in 2011. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. APOLLYON Ex Machina. He could feel it all around him, the fear and hatred. He could sense it in the air as he glided through the corridors, the quickly averted glances, the scurrying out of his way, the waves of relief behind him that he had passed by them and would not be stopping just yet. And always, hanging in the air like an acid mist, his name, spoken in awed whispers by those he passed, the Disassembler. After all this time, it still affected him. He knew the others would never, could never, accept him and his mission for what they were. He himself. He blanked from his mind the magnitude of it all. It was a job. It was his job. He and the job were unique to one another, wedded for the length of his existence. He reached the end of the corridor without glancing to either side. There was never any need. He knew what they felt, what they thought of him, without having to look. He opened the door before him and glided easily into the room beyond. There had been a steady hum in the air, the collected sounds of the machines performing their routine tasks, the ordinary chitterings of daily effort. But all that stopped the instant he came through the portal. No room could be ordinary once he had entered it. Who has he come for? The unspoken thought was as clear as though it had been shouted. Which one of us will go? The disassembler turned his head slowly, scanning the room in a smooth motion until his eyes lit on the Series 17 biostatic regulator mounted halfway up the wall. When the regulator realized the disassembler was staring at him, his red and blue monitor lights lit up abruptly to give an appearance of alert functioning. The disassembler crossed the room, well aware that all eyes followed him. He stopped when he reached the regulator and, without a word, pressed the button at his side. A slit appeared down the front of his chest, and the disassembler reached inside himself to remove his delicate instruments. "No!" the regulator shouted suddenly. "Not me! There must have been some mistake. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm working perfectly." The disassembler said nothing. With practiced ease, he took the demagnetizer from his chest cabinet and began removing the regulator's casing. "I'm too new to be disassembled." The regulator's voice had risen in pitch. "I was only installed on 230891. I had a work check last month and everything was fine. Just ask my repairer. I stay in optimum energy configuration and hardly ever use my lights. I've got a lot of good years left in me. I've never spent a day in the repair dock. Check my readouts. I've always done my work without mistakes. Ask anyone here. Please ask them." Around the room, the other machines were quiet. No one wanted to speak. Not to him, not to the disassembler. It was the universal fear that if they spoke to him, if they in any way acknowledged his presence, he might take them as well. Ignore disassembly, was the superstitious belief, and it somehow won't happen to you. The regulator was vibrating now, its frequency a jarring note within the otherwise silent room. "Please, someone tell him. Tell him I'm all right, please." The disassembler had the machine's casing off now and was working with delicate tools inside the regulator's chassis. Disassembly was more than a mere cessation of function. That could be accomplished with just a sledgehammer. There was, rather, the sensitive art of taking apart, of separating the good components from the bad, of making sure nothing useful was wasted. Why can't they learn? He thought as he worked. Why must disassembly be thought of only as an ending? Can't they see it's a beginning as well? If they weren't disassembled, there'd be no components to reassemble new machines, and the world could not go on. He did not speak aloud. He had learned long ago that nothing was gained by debate. It was simpler to be silent. He could finish more quickly, which was better for all concerned. The regulator continued its protests right up to the last. Its panicked voice was cut off in mid-syllable as the disassembler smoothly detached the final connections. The light in his forehead illuminated the now-defunct regulator's innards, checking that all the vital components had been separated. It was a clean job, as always. Gathering his tools together, he stored them efficiently within his chest cabinet. The parts wagon would be here very soon, and he wanted to be gone by then. He did not like to be around when the ghouls began their work. If the normal machines had an aversion to him, then he had an aversion to the reclaimers. They were entirely too eager to do their job, too hurried to appreciate the delicacy with which he had done his own work. Get the parts back to assembly was their only goal. They were fast and usually sloppy. He had too much respect for his victims, even for the sniveling biostatic regulator, to feel at ease in the face of that. Besides, he had more calls to make. With his task completed and his tools stored away once more, he glided out of the room. The door slid noiselessly shut behind him. None of the other machines had spoken since the moment of his entry. They would remain silent for a while, probably until after the reclaimers left. Then, slowly, they would begin again, the same idle chatter they had been about when he'd entered. The disassembly of their comrade would be put aside, a bad dream never to be mentioned again. Disassembly would come to all eventually, but why talk of it in the meantime? The disassembler had seen the pattern too many times. He knew he could never change it. His next stop was Repair Dock 4. The nature of his work kept him in the repair docks much of the time, almost as much as the repairers themselves. He moved through the corridors at his usual pace. He never hurried, but he always arrived at his destination quickly. Perhaps that was because there was never anyone who could impede him, or dared to. Repair Dock 4 was one of the larger ones, and still it was filled. Long rows of workbenches extended from one end of the room to the other. Each bench had on it a machine in some state of repair, and there were others crowded in a corner, waiting for room on a bench. Even though the environment was kept scrupulously clean, the air felt heavy with the taint of lubricant and solder. There was one repairer on duty here, number DED 518. Of all the repairers, the disassembler liked her the best. The rest of her kind ignored him as thoroughly as did the other machines, or if they did acknowledge him, it was as the enemy, the arch-villain who undid all they labored to achieve. He had even known repairers who tried to step between him and his work. Admittedly, some of them could perform miracles, keeping apparently useless equipment functioning for days, even years. But the disassembler got them all eventually. DED 518 was different from the others. She alone seemed to realize that the disassembler was, in a sense, a partner rather than an antagonist. There would always be jurisdictional disputes, but she did not doubt that some machines were better off disassembled than repaired. She was almost the only one left that the disassembler could talk to, and he hated to think of the day when her turn might come. She was repairing an orthocontroller as he came in, and her back was to the door. She did not have to look up to sense him, however. She had known his presence too many times before. Without stopping in her work, she said, "I think you'll want the one on bench 24. He's beyond all repair. I've been expecting you for hours now." "Yes," the disassembler said. "Number 24 and number 15. Now the repairer looked up. She uttered an impolite crackle of static and said, "Not 15. I just spent 4 hours rerouting his circuits and charging his coils." The disassembler stood silently. There could be no arguing with his orders. After a moment, the repairer accepted that. She put down her tools and came over to him. "All right," she said slowly. "What was it? What did I miss?" "You didn't miss anything," the disassembler told her gently. "It was just overload. His system was too worn out from other defects to accept what you were doing for him. Just overload. Is that supposed to make me feel better? How I hate those words. Do you even know what defeat is? Have you ever lost one? Sometimes a repairer will take one away from me, get it working well enough that Central Console changes its mind and decides not to disassemble. Sure, a temporary setback, but you know you'll get it eventually. You don't know what it is to work for hours using all your skills and knowledge, only to be told at the end that your work was worthless because of just overload. You don't have to worry. Everything always comes to you. Everything with moving parts will wear out eventually," the disassembler said. "There's no way to change that. Only Central Console has no moving parts. Only Central Console will last until this world reaches the new galaxy and the people wake again. For everything else, the cycle of assembly, repair, disassembly, and reassembly must go on. That's the way of the world." The repairer rolled slowly back to her workbench and picked up her tools once more. "Perhaps," she said, "but you can't stop me from trying to invent perpetual motion." "I wouldn't think of stopping you," said the disassembler. "I only caution you not to be disappointed when you don't do it." He glided to workbench 24 and began disassembling the poor machine that lay upon it. It was a fast job. As the repairer had pointed out, there was little here to salvage. "You should be glad to see me," he said as he worked. "If I didn't come by to clear off your benches every once in a while, you'd have no room for them." He gestured at the pile of machines in the corner, still awaiting service. "Small thanks for small favors," the repairer muttered. As the disassembler finished his work on bench 24 and moved to bench 15, he noticed that the repairer was installing a new FC1428 component into the orthocontroller on her bench. Despite himself, the disassembler stopped and watched her insert the new part, until even she noticed something strange. She looked up at him. "Is something the matter?" she asked. "No," he said, moving quickly into position and starting work on his latest victim. "I just couldn't help noticing that you had an FC1428. "Yes, I'm lucky. They're not easy to come by." The disassembler made no comment. He was only too aware of that fact. He did not look at the component again, but he did memorize the orthocontroller's serial number for future reference. He had finished his work here and was starting to pack up when he suddenly stiffened. There was a silent call coming in from Central Console, giving him a new set of instructions. At almost the same instant, an alarm bell rang throughout the repair dock. DED 518 looked to him for advice. "We'd better hurry," the disassembler said. "There's been an accident at 4PR 189. A metal fracture caused part of a wall to give way. There'll be plenty of work for both of us." The disassembler tucked his tools neatly away inside his chest cabinet, while the repairer grabbed frantically for her kit. Both reached the doorway simultaneously and sped down the hall side by side, racing to the scene of the disaster. Although they traveled at the same rate, the disassembler moved more smoothly and seemingly with less effort. He was sure the repairer hated him for that. There were two other repairers already on the scene when they arrived. The area was a mess. Some minute flaw in the crystalline structure of the wall had, after all these ages, finally yielded under the pressure, collapsing the wall and part of the ceiling on the scores of machines that had been trapped underneath. More machines from the next level up had fallen in when their floor collapsed, making this section a mass of twisted metal and broken parts. Throughout the chaos, the disassembler moved with calm efficiency, while the repairers jumped hastily from machine to machine. No one interfered with the disassembler, no one got in his way, but the repairers nonetheless made it clear they wanted to take as much business away from him as possible. "It's so unfair," DED 518 remarked, as, at one point, she and the disassembler were working alongside one another on two different machines. "You can move so much more quickly than we can. We have to work 3 times as fast just to keep pace with you. My job is easier," said the disassembler, and moved on. The reclaimers arrived at the scene, adding to the confusion. They followed in the disassembler's wake, hardly waiting for him to straighten his tools and move on before pouncing on his latest subject and filing it into the parts wagon. The reclaimers were small, chittering vermin with few, if any, redeeming characteristics. The one thing that made them tolerable was the knowledge that someday the disassembler would be coming after each of them, too. It took more than 2 hours, but at last the job was finished. The hopeless cases had been disassembled and carted off in the parts wagon. The salvageable ones had been transferred to the nearest repair docks. Constructors had arrived to rebuild the damaged wall. The repairers stood around for a few minutes, comparing notes and congratulating themselves on their successes. Even DED 518 was ignoring the disassembler for the moment. He left without saying goodbye. The disassembler never said goodbye. He always knew he would see someone at least once more, and there was still work for him to do. His next destination was a narrow, dusty back corridor. At the end, up in a corner, were a small autorotor and a stator working in tandem. Neither was equipped with visual perceptors, but like everyone else, they could sense the disassembler's presence without such basic input. Surprisingly, they were not frightened. "Have you come for us, then?" asked the autorotor quietly. "Just for the stator," the disassembler replied. "I've expected you for months," sighed the stator. "My functioning has been irregular for some time. I've more than outlived my usefulness. Disassembly will be a relief after all these years." "Please take me too," the autorotor added. "We'd like to go together." "Just the stator," the disassembler repeated. "You don't understand," said the autorotor. Although her voice remained quiet, there was the quaver of a plea behind it. "He and I have always been together, ever since we were first installed years ago. We're a team. It wouldn't be right for me not to be with him. There's no one else here. I'd be so lonely." The disassembler seldom spoke with his victims. They were usually busy shouting at him or vilifying him. The autorotor was doing neither, however, and her tender plea drew him out of himself. "Another stator will be installed here, a newer one." "Bah! What do I need with some bright, shiny new stator? I'm old myself. I probably won't last more than another month or 2 at the most. You'll be coming for me soon enough anyway, won't you?" "I couldn't say." "Please don't leave me alone here. That's all I ask. That should be easy enough. What would it matter to you?" "Nothing," said the disassembler. "It wouldn't matter at all." "Then why not do it?" The stator tried gently to calm his partner. Now, stop making such a fuss. He's only doing his job. We've been together for years and years. You'll probably welcome a change. A new stator might even be good for you, help energize those old parts. The autorotor ignored him, addressing herself solely to the disassembler. It would only take you a few seconds more to disassemble me at the same time. It'll save you a trip here later. I can't do it, the disassembler said stubbornly. Sure you can. Just whip out your tools, open me up, and disconnect me. You have the power. Why won't you use it? Nobody understands, the disassembler said, half to himself. They think I make all the decisions. They think I choose who will be disassembled and who will remain. But I don't. I don't sit in judgment on anyone. All decisions come from Central Console, which monitors the world. It doesn't need to justify its reasons to me any more than I need to justify them to you. Central Console has its master plan to keep the world running smoothly, a plan that's beyond our comprehension and often contrary to our wishes. If Central says the stator must be disassembled and the autorotor left untouched, then that is what must be. I have no more ability to change it than you do. The autorotor was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, she whispered at last. So am I, thought the disassembler, but said nothing aloud. He returned to his customary silence as he began to disassemble the stator, but he did let the stator say a final farewell to his partner before disconnecting him completely. The stator was an older model, and as he worked, the disassembler checked his parts carefully. Sure enough, there in the back was an FC-1428, identical to the piece the disassembler had seen in the repair dock earlier. There was no one watching now, so he reached in and gingerly lifted out the component for inspection. The FC-1428 was old and brown around the edges. Even a casual glance told the disassembler this was one of the pieces that had failed in the stator, requiring his disassembly. This component would be as useless to the disassembler as it had been to the poor old stator. Reluctantly, he placed the piece back in the stator's chassis for the reclaimers to salvage. There was something else, though, a DB-18 unit. It looked practically new. The stator must have had repairs made recently. The disassembler reached in eagerly and, with a couple of quick snips, severed the DB-18 from its connections. The piece was not as hard to find as an FC-1428, but he could put it to good use nonetheless. Carefully, he tucked the component into his chest cabinet behind his regular tools, straightened up, and left just before the reclaimers arrived with the parts wagon. They would be puzzled by the absence of the DB-18, but that was not his concern. He found himself unexpectedly with one of his infrequent periods of relaxation. Central Console had no disassemblies scheduled anywhere in the world for a while. He knew he had to take advantage of such moments while he could, or lose them forever. Another period of inactivity might not occur for days or even weeks. With haste now, he glided quietly through the corridors of the world, not even bothering to notice the reactions of the machines around him. It took half an hour to reach his private little niche, a disused storeroom that he hoped even Central Console had forgotten. Here there were no other machines, no other sounds but those he produced himself. Here he could think and work in the few moments of privacy that were genuinely his own. He switched on his headlamp and glided slowly up to the other form in the room. Opening his chest cabinet, he removed the contraband DB-18 unit and connected it painstakingly to the appropriate spot within the structure. Perhaps it was silly to think that Central Console did not know what he was doing here. Perhaps it was egotistical to think he could accomplish his goal in secret. Central Console monitored all reclaimed parts. It would surely keep track of those that were missing, and it would know what could be built using them. But Central Console had never made a single reference to this project. Perhaps that was merely because it didn't care, or even that it was giving its tacit approval. The disassembler neither knew nor cared what Central Console thought about it. It was enough that he could do this work, whether it was secret or not. It is ironic, he thought, that the disassembler should be both a disassembler and an assembler as well. His predecessor had been most generous, for which the disassembler was grateful. A complete set of plans and programming instructions had been left here. The rest was up to him. All it took was time and scavenged parts. When he'd begun the project, it looked hopeless. The handful of stolen components had formed a shapeless mass, not really resembling anything. But over the months, the years, the decades that followed, the creation began to assume its own familiar shape. Soon, thought the disassembler, it's almost ready. There aren't many more pieces to find. Perhaps, he comforted himself, that orthocontroller he'd seen in Repair Dock 4 would break down completely and he could steal its FC-1428. At any rate, it would not be long before his new disassembler was ready to be activated. And then the radio call came in, bringing an end to his short recess. As ever, there were machines to be disassembled. His services were required, and he must emerge from this sanctuary into a world of hatred and misunderstanding once more. Just before he left, though, he glanced up at the sign that had been scrawled above the doorway. The disassembler did not know who had written it, whether it was his predecessor or someone even older than that. Perhaps, at one time, it had been intended as a warning or threat. But now, in the irony of ironies, it provided him the only hope he had ever known. Disassembler, thou too shalt be disassembled.